Hey guys, we're back. Chris Fonsi, Greg Ruiz, and we are here to talk about good practices in API design, part 1. Let's actually start this out with this is a quiz, right? What's wrong with this picture?
Chris, I don't know. It looks perfectly normal. I mean, you and I both travel so much. I've seen this time and time
I think
again.
you and I both travel way the heck too much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, I could probably tell you which airline this was on.
Well, I don't know if I can do that, but I can tell you what's wrong with this picture, I think.
Well, I think I've got a good idea as well. I think somebody was trying to do some cost savings there.
That could very well be. You know, you could probably argue that the airline should have taken out the ashtray instead of putting a sticker above that says no smoking. But okay, so we'll give the airline one. But I think this kind of illustrates one of the key points about API design. We actually talked about this a little bit in the previous session, but I think this really kind of drives the point home. This is about ambiguity and about the use of APIs and making something as clear as possible so that there's no ambiguity around exactly how it should function and exactly what result you should expect.
Right. Exactly. And I mean, sure, even as we laugh about this, it is very, very confusing. Am I allowed to or am I not allowed to smoke if I was so inclined?
Yeah. Of course the stewardesses tend to go, no smoking.
Exactly right.
But,
of course. Of course.
I don't smoke anyway. I haven't smoked in years, so whatever. What about this one?
Oh, this is one of my favorites.
I love this.
And again, I've seen this time and time again. Really, as you look at that picture the first time, your brain sort of latches on and says something's wrong here, but it takes you a minute to really realize what is wrong.
Yep.
And I think when we're talking about API design, I think that's one of the really important things is not to make a developer looking at your API think that one thing happens when it was really intended to do something else, right?
Totally agree. I mean, in this particular case, the handles are kind of ambiguous, and this is another example of ambiguity in design. In this particular case, they even went so far as to tell you to push, but still the design of the system, if you will, makes you want to do something else. And so, not only do you have to give people explicit instructions on what to do, but you have to design in such a way that it kind of forces them to do it, so that when they try something out, they get exactly the result that they expect.
Absolutely. Have you ever pulled when you were supposed to push?
Maybe. Maybe.
Oh, no, this one's hard.
This just cracks me up. It totally cracks me up. I mean, anyone who walks into a room like this, I think, could come across with a distinct impression that that thing in the corner has a certain specific purpose. And they even went so far as to point out that it has a completely different purpose. This just extends the idea that you have to be very, very explicit in how you design your API, not only providing that level of documentation, but really kind of reinforcing the uses so that people can't make mistakes.
Right, exactly.
And they can't use it in a way that's not.
It's that assumption thing. I looked at your API and I thought I made that assumption and it was wrong.
Yeah.
But for that picture, I've got one question.
Pray tell.
Why didn't they make that sign much bigger?
I don't know, man.
How about putting a bucket in there with a mop? That way you would have known, right?
Yeah.
It's that same thing about API design.
I agree.
If I make it clear, then you're not going to make a wrong assumption.
I agree. Yeah, I think it would have been great if they could have done something to really kind of make the purpose of that thing in the corner clear.
Right. Well, and in fact, that is sort of what we want to talk about, right? In designing for purpose, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's this design concept called affordance, which is basically building a design in such a way that the purpose of whatever it is that you're designing is immediately obvious. And then this applies equally with APIs as it does with just about anything like teapots. I mean, you can look at a teapot and, within reason, you can pretty much figure out what a teapot is supposed to do.
Absolutely.
And if you design APIs in such a way that the purpose of the API is fairly straightforward, you end up with this level of affordance that just makes it intuitively obvious what you're supposed to do.
Now, I've got a question, though. I mean, yeah, you and I know that that's a teapot. What would happen if I tried to brew coffee in the teapot?
People have thought about this.
You can tell we're real geeks now.
We are super geeky, right? There was an RFC that came out one April Fool's Day a long time ago. I don't remember the exact year, but they actually introduced a new status code called 418 I'm a Teapot to tell people what they should expect if they brew coffee in a teapot.
Right.
Go figure. I like the little reference to short and stout, but that's because I'm a geek. A less geeky note, I guess.
Right.
This picture is actually super funny because it was taken at a time back before road lines were put onto roads.
Oh, wow.
And
Yeah,
back before that time,
you never even think about the fact that there might have been a time that they weren't there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you can just imagine now, we're so used to driving down the road and, staying in lanes within reason, and we at least understand the purpose of lanes, right? But back in the day when they didn't have such things, it was a lot more difficult, and you ran into situations like this all the time.
Right, so putting that into an API perspective.
This, from my perspective, if we try to apply this to APIs, it basically means that there's a certain number of guidelines that you should put in place in API design. Part of it is in the design itself, part of it is in the documentation, in the code samples, but giving people at least some sense as to how API should be used and how your particular API should be used is super valuable.
Absolutely.
It saves your time, it saves developers' time, and it's just a good thing to do overall.
And that's both from the design perspective, but also from documentation, as you pointed
Absolutely. Absolutely. Speaking of documentation, I have to admit, I have been around long enough to where I remember when this book first came out. And this is admittedly one of my favorite books when it comes to software design books. I really like it.
Yeah, I've got a Unix book on my bookshelf that, I'll never throw away. Even though I rarely use it anymore. But
right.
It's that, but in that design patterns, right? That book in particular, I'm coming from a programming background as well that, I understand object orientedness, but you're talking about facade patterns here, and that's always been sort of my weak link. I've never really understood what exactly is that.
Well, you can basically think of your API as a facade. The API has a well-defined contract. It's a contract that you make with your developer community, if you will, the people that are going to use your API. And it basically insulates the developer from all of the sausage making, if you will, that takes place behind the covers. And you can do all sorts of things behind your API in your back-end systems, elsewhere in your environment. But as long as you create that consistent contract and you make it as usable as possible, which is fundamentally what the facade's all about,
right,
then it just makes your developer's life so much easier because they don't have to be concerned with all that stuff that takes place.
Right.
So we'll talk about a lot of different concepts in API design. We'll talk about statelessness, for example, and some other things that if they were exposed to developers, it might potentially cause some challenges in the adoption of the API and so on. Whereas if you really take this facade pattern to heart, then
you're hiding the complexity.
Exactly.
That's great.
Exactly.
Well, so I think we've talked about our philosophies and our guiding principles. I think probably it's about time to actually build some APIs. Talk about what it looks like as we put that into practice.
Let's do it.
I think maybe that'll help clear some things up.
Let's do it.
All right.
Next session.